Good day and welcome back to the channel. Today we're looking at a real episode from the winter of 1951, an operational decision made in seconds that disrupted an incoming strike and bought time for a city on the edge. This is not a legend and not a dramatization. It's the kind of small-scale action that appears in reports as a few lines, yet carries strategic weight. We begin over Seoul, on a morning when one aircraft met a formation it was never meant to face alone. January 17, 1951, 9:42 in the morning. A low gray ceiling of cloud pressed down over the frozen Han River Valley. The temperature was around -10 Celsius. A weak north wind slid under the cloud base, and visibility sat at roughly 8 kilometers. Good enough to see shapes, not good enough to trust what you saw at distance. Over the eastern outskirts of Seoul, an F-51D Mustang climbed through broken layers of haze, its propeller carving a steady rhythm into thin winter air. Senior Lieutenant Kim Yong-soo of the Republic of Korea Air Force was alone in the sky, and that fact mattered more than the aircraft type or the weather. It was his 28th combat sortie since the Chinese People's Volunteers and the Korean People's Army intensified the winter pressure on Seoul. He was 24. His own flight was supposed to join him 15 minutes later, delayed at Suwon Air Base by frozen hydraulic lines on the ramp. An unremarkable technical problem that became decisive only because of timing. In January 1951, solo patrols were discouraged on paper and accepted in practice. Airframes were limited, pilots were tired, and weather regularly broke the neat schedules of operations staff. Kim's orders were simple and tightly defined. Patrol the approach corridors to Seoul, report enemy formations, and avoid engagement until support arrived. In doctrine, the patrol was a moving sensor. In reality, it became the first and sometimes only layer of defense. Below him, Seoul was not a single city, but a patchwork of damage and movement. Roofless blocks and blackened ruins stood beside narrow roads packed with refugees heading south. The winter had turned earth hard and rivers into barriers, forcing columns into predictable routes. Seoul had already changed hands twice since the war began in June 1950, and by mid-January 1951, it was again under direct threat. The defense of the capital was not just a military problem, it was a logistics problem measured in fuel, bridges, field hospitals, and the ability to move men and supplies through a city that could be broken in an hour. At 09:44, Kim saw motion to the northeast, first as dark points in a dull sky, then as shapes that resolved into wings and fuselages as they crossed into clearer air. He counted quickly and conservatively, no fewer than 30 aircraft. The core of the formation consisted of Il-10 ground attack aircraft flying at roughly 2,000 meters, heavy, armored machines designed to survive fire while striking targets on the ground. Above them and out on the flanks were Yak-9 fighters acting as escort, some marked with Chinese insignia. Their course line was steady and direct, toward Seoul. The timing was not accidental. Over the previous 2 weeks, similar raids had hit what mattered most: fuel stocks, temporary river crossings, and medical points close to the front. Intelligence summaries in this period pointed to a clear operational logic: exploit winter weather, reduced fighter availability, and the strain on airfields to push strikes through with speed and audacity. Around Seoul, airfields still held evacuation aircraft and wounded personnel, and supply dumps remained close enough to be vulnerable. If those were destroyed, the defense of the capital would not fail dramatically. It would simply stop functioning. Kim checked his own aircraft as a pilot trained to translate numbers into decisions. Fuel in the internal tanks was full, roughly 700 liters. Ammunition for the 650 caliber Browning machine guns amounted to around 1,880 rounds in total, enough for a few short, controlled firing passes, not enough to stay in a prolonged fight. The F-51D Mustang offered speed, range, and heavy armament, but it was not a modern jet, and it was not built to outturn a Yak-9 at low altitude. The tactical logic for a lone Mustang against escort fighters was clear. Do not get dragged into a turning engagement. Keep energy, strike quickly, and leave. He went to the radio because doctrine demanded it before anything else. The reply was only static, terrain interference, winter atmospheric effects, and distance. Suwon was still struggling with frozen systems. His flight was not in the air yet, and in front of him, the enemy formation had less than 10 minutes to reach the outskirts of Seoul. That window was too short for paperwork, too short for perfect coordination, and too short for hesitation. If the IL-10s reached their planned attack line, their 23mm cannons and bombs could shred southern districts and, more importantly, break the fragile infrastructure that kept defenders moving: bridges, depots, and casualty routes. In this kind of campaign, a single strike could create a gap that infantry would exploit by afternoon. Kim understood that if he simply observed and waited, he would preserve his aircraft, but he would likely lose the ground situation below. The choice was between correct procedure and immediate effect. He made the decision in seconds: throttle forward. The Packard-built Merlin V1650 responded with instant power. The Mustang accelerated past 500 kilometers per hour and climbed, angling toward the brighter part of the sky where the sun could mask his approach. Surprise was his only true advantage. The enemy expected resistance over the target where defenders were concentrated, not on the approach corridor where confidence and weather often created gaps. Kim selected the leading IL-10 group, not because it was the easiest kill, but because it was the formation's spine. The IL-10s were armored, yes, but they flew in tight spacing to deliver a coordinated strike. Break that structure, and you break the raid's timing. At roughly 3,500 meters, Kim rolled over into a diving attack. Speed rose fast, 600, then 650 kilometers per hour. The IL-10s still flew straight, either unaware or unwilling to scatter too early and lose their attack geometry. At about 800 meters, he fired. Tracers reached out in a tight stream and walked onto the leftmost IL-10, wing and engine area. Smoke appeared first, then flame. The attack aircraft jerked, lost stability, and dropped away. The formation fractured immediately. Aircraft spilled outward, climbing or diving to avoid collision, and the precise spacing needed for an organized strike evaporated. Seconds later, Yak-9 fighters flashed across Kim's canopy line, closing in. The strike on Seoul had been disrupted before it reached the city. But in that moment, the situation reversed completely. The objective was no longer the IL-10s. Now every gun and every turn in the sky was oriented toward a single Mustang, one aircraft that had chosen to trade safety for time. Write in the comments which city you're watching from and subscribe to the channel. It's the best support. And now we move on. The Yak-9s moved first, and they did so with discipline. 4 fighters descended from above and to the right, exploiting their advantage at lower speeds and tighter turning radii. Kim did not attempt to meet them in a horizontal maneuver. He pushed the nose down instead, trading altitude for speed. In that moment, doctrine and instinct aligned. A turning fight would strip the Mustang of energy within seconds. Speed was the only defense that still worked. Breaking contact entirely was not an option. If he ran south immediately, the IL-10s would recover their formation and continue towards Seoul with minimal delay. Kim's position between the attackers and the city gave him leverage, but only if he remained close enough to threaten another pass. His task was no longer interception in the classic sense. It was disruption through presence, forcing the enemy to react to him instead of the ground below. One Yak-9 crossed his flight path too tightly. Kim fired a brief, instinctive burst without adjusting aim. The rounds missed, but the effect was immediate. The fighter broke away sharply, abandoning its approach. A second pair attacked from below, their tracers streaking upward beneath the fuselage. The Mustang shuddered as G-forces pinned Kim into his seat. The cockpit heater, already unreliable, failed completely. The cold was no longer background discomfort. It was an active distraction, stiffening hands and slowing fine motor control. Below and slightly behind him, the IL-10s began to regroup. What had been a shattered formation was reorganizing into 3 compact elements of 4 aircraft each. The process was deliberate and efficient. Distance to Seoul was now roughly 12 kilometers. At their current speed, they would reach the outer districts in minutes. Kim understood that if they stabilized, he would have one final chance at best before the attack resumed in full. He rolled the Mustang back into a steep dive. Speed climbed past 650 kilometers per hour, then stabilized near 670. At that velocity, the Yak-9s could not follow without risking loss of control. The separation bought him seconds, just enough. Kim lined up on the rightmost IL-10 group and opened fire from approximately 400 meters, selecting a longer burst despite the cost in ammunition. The round struck the tail section of one aircraft. Control surfaces failed. The IL-10 yawed violently and collided with the machine flying beside it. Both dropped away in flames. The effect was immediate and disproportionate. The remaining IL-10s scattered sharply, abandoning any attempt at formation. Pilots jettisoned bombs without coordination, releasing them over empty ground to reduce weight and regain maneuverability. Those weapons fell far from their intended targets. For Seoul, that mattered more than the loss of aircraft. The planned strike had collapsed. The airspace, however, became more dangerous. The Yak-9 escorts responded with renewed aggression. Kim counted at least 10 fighters in his immediate vicinity. One approached head-on, closing at a combined speed exceeding 1,000 kilometers per hour. There was no time for evasive maneuver. Both pilots fired. Kim felt the impact through the airframe, a solid, unmistakable strike. The Mustang lurched. A warning indicator flickered on the panel. Coolant pressure. The engine temperature began to rise almost immediately. The radiator had been punctured. In winter conditions, that kind of damage did not lead to instant failure, but it set a clear limit. Under full power, the Merlin engine could survive perhaps 10 to 15 minutes before overheating to the point of seizure. Throttling back would extend its life, but at the cost of speed. Slower speed meant vulnerability. Kim did not hesitate. He kept the throttle where it was. Another Yak-9 crossed his nose. Kim fired a short, controlled burst. This time, there was a visible result. The fighter trailed smoke and peeled away, disengaging toward the north. The ammunition counters in Kim's mind began to matter now. Each burst was a calculation. Each second of engine operation was a trade against future failure. The Mustang vibrated more with every minute. Temperature gauges climbed steadily toward the red. Kim felt the aircraft aging beneath him, systems failing, not dramatically, but cumulatively. He was no longer flying with reserve. He was consuming the last margins deliberately. At last, the IL-10s turned north. Their escorts followed in loose order. The mission was over. Seoul would not be attacked that morning. The sky, suddenly emptier, felt vast and quiet by comparison. Kim turned south toward Suwon. The Yak-9s did not pursue closely. They stayed at a distance, observing. Their pilots understood the situation as clearly as Kim did. A damaged Mustang, running hot, low on ammunition, and alone, did not need to be shot down immediately. Time would do the work. As Kim leveled out and set a course for home, the engine continued to run, but it no longer sounded the same. The vibration deepened. Temperature readings crept higher. The fight for Seoul had been won. Now began a different fight, one against failing machinery and the limits of endurance. And that fight was already underway. The coolant temperature crossed the critical threshold within minutes of Kim's turn to the south. The needle shook in the red zone, vibrating rather than settling, a sign of unstable flow rather than a simple overheat. The change was audible as much as visible. The Merlin's previously even tone fractured into a rough, irregular pattern, each cylinder firing slightly out of rhythm. Coolant was escaping somewhere forward of the firewall, and the freezing outside air amplified thermal stress inside the engine instead of relieving it. Kim eased the throttle back briefly to test the response. The result was immediate and unforgiving. Airspeed decayed, the aircraft's nose sagged, and the Mustang lost the thin margin that separated controlled flight from exposure. He restored power almost at once. In theory, reducing throttle could prolong engine life. In practice, it would invite pursuit. An overheating engine still producing thrust was preferable to a healthy engine destroyed by enemy fire. Behind him, 3 Yak-9s maintained their distance. They flew slightly higher, offset to his rear quarter, careful not to close. No shots were fired. The intent was clear. A damaged aircraft over hostile territory did not require immediate destruction. A forced landing or bailout would end the engagement without risk, conserving fuel, ammunition, and aircraft for later missions. The enemy pilots were no longer fighting him. They were waiting him out. 2 minutes later, the oil pressure warning light illuminated. At first it flickered, then remained steady. The gauge dropped rapidly. Oil was escaping through ruptured lines or a cracked housing, and internal components were beginning to operate without proper lubrication. At this stage, flight manuals were unambiguous. Engine seizure was no longer a possibility, it was an expectation. The only uncertainty was timing. At approximately 2,500 meters, the engine misfired violently. A sharp metallic bang echoed through the airframe, followed by a sudden loss of thrust. For a fraction of a second, the propeller slowed perceptibly, then partial power returned. Kim reacted instinctively, adjusting the throttle by feel rather than sight, seeking a narrow balance where the engine still produced usable output without accelerating its own destruction. The aircraft began to sink, first at roughly 300 meters per minute, then fast. Smoke entered the cockpit soon after. Initially, it appeared as a thin haze creeping in from the instrument panel. Within seconds, it thickened, stinging the eyes and throat. This was not fire yet. It was oil and coolant vaporizing as they contacted overheated engine components. Kim cracked the canopy open. The rush of sub-zero air was violent, but it cleared enough fumes to restore visibility and breathing. A Yak-9 slid into view on Kim's left, flying almost level with the Mustang's cockpit. The proximity was deliberate and controlled. Kim could see the pilot clearly, fur-lined helmet, oxygen mask secured, dark goggles reflecting the pale winter sky. The enemy pilot raised a hand and gestured downward, a simple motion understood without translation. Land. Give up the aircraft. End the flight. Kim did not respond. His attention never left the forward view. Ahead lay broken terrain, frozen rivers, and the long stretch of ground separating him from friendly lines. Surrender would mean captivity at best, disappearance at worst. The choice was not ideological or emotional, it was procedural. As long as the aircraft moved forward, there was still an option. Moments later, oil pressure dropped to zero. The gauge needle collapsed against its stop. Under normal circumstances, the engine should have seized almost immediately, pistons welding themselves to cylinder walls within seconds. Instead, the Merlin continued running, sustained only by residual oil film, mechanical inertia, and tolerances designed for combat abuse. Each second increased vibration, transmitted directly through the control stick and rudder pedals. Then, fire appeared. A brief flash beneath the cowling, followed by a steady tongue of flame drawn backward along the fuselage by the slipstream. Fire at this stage was less dangerous than sudden detonation, but the risk was clear. If flames reached intact fuel lines or tank vents, the aircraft would be lost instantly. Kim cut fuel flow for a fraction of a second, then restored it, attempting to disrupt combustion without extinguishing the engine entirely. The flames diminished but did not go out. They remained intermittent, flaring and shrinking with airflow and engine load. Altitude fell below 1,500 meters. Suwon lay roughly 20 kilometers ahead, distant but not unreachable in still air. The Yak-9s broke away at last, climbing northward. Their role was finished. Gravity, heat, and friction were now sufficient opponents. The Mustang continued south, trailing smoke and fire, its engine running beyond every calculated limit. There was no longer any tactical situation to assess, no enemy movement to anticipate. The question had narrowed to a single variable: whether the failing engine could continue producing power long enough to reach the airfield. What followed would be decided not by combat training, but by physics, endurance, and minutes measured one vibration at a time. Control degradation became unmistakable, just below 1,300 meters. What Kim initially interpreted as pilot fatigue or stiffness from cold revealed itself as cumulative structural damage asserting its consequences. Control cables, already stressed by combat maneuvers and battle damage, were stretching unevenly. Pulleys resisted smooth movement. The Mustang no longer responded as a coherent system, but as a collection of strained components. A slow, persistent roll to the right developed, subtle at first, then increasingly difficult to counter. The nose also began to drop, as if the aircraft were gradually surrendering its lift. Kim applied corrective input through the control stick and rudder pedals. The response came late and incomplete, forcing him to overcorrect, then compensate again. Each adjustment required more force than the last. This was not a sudden failure, but a progressive loss of authority, the kind that offers no clear moment to react, only a narrowing window in which mistakes become irreversible. Smoke thickened inside the cockpit. It no longer drifted in wisps, but pooled around the instrument panel and rose toward Kim's face. Peripheral vision blurred, not from panic, but from physiology. Carbon monoxide exposure advanced quietly, impairing judgment before announcing itself as danger. Kim slid the canopy fully open despite the risk. The resulting roar of air was violent, but the rush of cold oxygen cut through the haze just enough to keep him conscious and oriented. The ground below came into sharper focus as altitude decreased. Snow-covered fields passed beneath him in uneven motion, broken by the dark outlines of destroyed villages and abandoned roads. The front line was no longer an abstract concept marked on maps. It was directly beneath him. Any loss of control now would end not with recovery, but with impact in contested territory. At approximately 1,100 meters, effective control ceased altogether. The Mustang stopped responding predictably to inputs. The right roll intensified, and the nose dropped more sharply. The aircraft entered an uncontrolled descent. Airspeed increased rapidly, 400 kilometers per hour, then 450. Vertical speed followed. Kim evaluated his options in seconds, not emotionally but mechanically. There was no ejection seat. Bailout was possible only in theory. The altitude was marginal, the aircraft unstable, and airflow chaotic. A parachute, even if deployed, would likely not fully open in time. Impact was less than a minute away. In that narrowing space, Kim recalled a technique mentioned only briefly during advanced instruction. It was never practiced and never recommended as procedure. The idea was simple but extreme. An aircraft with asymmetric lift and damaged control geometry might behave differently when inverted. Gravity and aerodynamic forces would act against each other. Forces pulling the nose down in upright flight might, when reversed, generate a stabilizing effect. At roughly 800 meters, Kim committed to the maneuver. He applied left rudder and forced the Mustang into a roll, fighting resistance from damaged controls. The aircraft hesitated, then rolled through. The horizon inverted. Negative G-forces slammed Kim against his harness. Blood surged toward his head, narrowing his vision into a dark tunnel. The engine coughed violently as fuel flow faltered. The Merlin systems were never designed to operate under sustained negative acceleration. But something changed. The rapid increase in airspeed stopped. The nose lifted relative to the inverted horizon. The descent slowed. For the first time in over a minute, the aircraft was no longer accelerating toward the ground. For several seconds, the Mustang flew upside down. Smoke streamed backward along the fuselage, punctuated by intermittent flashes of flame. It was not stable flight, but it was flight. Kim held the inverted attitude with constant pressure, counting seconds rather than meters. Every moment in negative G carried risks: fuel starvation, engine stoppage, loss of consciousness. But each second bought altitude and time. After roughly 30 seconds, the engine began to falter again. Power dropped unevenly, and vibration intensified. Kim rolled the aircraft upright once more. Immediately, the damaged aerodynamics reasserted themselves. The nose dropped. The descent resumed. He waited. Altitude fell. Airspeed climbed again. Then he inverted the aircraft once more. The effect repeated. Upright flight produced loss of control and rapid sink. Inverted flight partially stabilized the aircraft and reduced vertical speed. This pattern became his only means of progress, rolling from one attitude to the other, exploiting physics rather than commanding the machine. This was no longer controlled flight in any formal sense. It was a sequence of deliberate corrections made at the edge of physical tolerance. Each inversion extracted a cost. The engine weakened further. Kim's strength diminished. Vision narrowed. Hands trembled from cold, fatigue, and strain. Yet the aircraft continued forward, meter by meter. The Yak-9s were gone. There was no longer any enemy presence in the sky. What Kim was doing no longer resembled air combat. It was mechanical survival, a contest between gravity and intention. At approximately 700 meters, familiar terrain features emerged south of Seoul. The outline of roads, the shape of fields, the alignment of structures, patterns seen before from training flights. He was still moving towards Suwon, though barely. Each cycle of inversion demanded more effort and yielded less margin. Then, through smoke and haze, a straight line appeared against the winter ground. Concrete. A runway. Suwon Air Base. It was distant, critically distant, but unmistakable. The Mustang, scarred by fire and damage, continued forward in a sequence of rolls and corrections. Its aerodynamics were compromised, its engine failing, its pilot near exhaustion. Yet motion persisted. The aircraft did not want to fly, but it was being forced to do so, one inversion at a time. Approximately 3 kilometers from the airfield, the engine stopped completely. There was no gradual loss this time, no warning needle drifting toward zero. One final metallic knock passed through the airframe, the RPM dropped sharply, and the propeller began to spin freely in the slipstream. Thrust vanished at once. The Mustang transitioned from powered flight to an unplanned glide, burdened by damage, smoke residue, and distorted surfaces that produced drag far beyond normal limits. Altitude at that moment was slightly above 500 meters. Under ideal conditions, it would have been barely sufficient. Under these conditions, it was critical. The aircraft's glide ratio was poor, its weight distribution compromised by fire damage and partial control failure. There would be no opportunity to circle, no chance to correct an approach gone wrong. The line to the runway would be the only line. Kim rolled the aircraft fully upright and focused on holding a stable pitch attitude. Control forces were heavy, uneven, and required constant correction. He held airspeed at approximately 210 kilometers per hour, well above standard landing speed for an F-51, but anything slower risked an immediate stall. With flaps unavailable and controls degraded, energy management became the only tool left. He reached for the landing gear selector out of habit more than hope. Nothing happened. The hydraulic system was engine-driven, and with the Merlin stopped, pressure was gone. The realization was immediate and precise. An unprepared belly landing on a damaged aircraft with ruptured fuel lines and residual fire risk almost guaranteed ignition on impact. The manual hand pump was the last option. Releasing one hand from the controls caused the aircraft to dip instantly. Kim reacted by bracing the control stick against his leg and harness, using his body to substitute for mechanical resistance. It was inelegant, but it worked. With both hands free, he began pumping the manual system, each stroke slow and forceful. 10 strokes produced nothing. The resistance felt unchanged. The aircraft continued to sink. Kim pumped again, his arms already heavy from earlier strain. At 20 strokes, resistance increased slightly. The motion became harder. At 28, a dull mechanical thud echoed through the fuselage. The left landing gear extended first. Moments later, the right followed. There were no indicator lights. The electrical system was compromised, and the cockpit offered no confirmation that the gear had locked into place. Kim did not attempt to cycle the system again. There was no altitude or time to verify. If the gear collapsed, it would collapse on the ground. With the landing gear extended, drag increased sharply. Airspeed bled off toward 170 kilometers per hour. Sink rate increased in response. Kim adjusted pitch constantly, compensating for asymmetrical resistance and subtle yaw introduced by uneven damage. The aircraft felt unstable but controllable, barely. Flaps remained unavailable. The same hydraulic failure that nearly cost him the gear had removed that option entirely. Without flaps, the landing would be fast, shallow, and unforgiving. Suwon's runway was short by peacetime standards and partially scarred by previous air attacks. There would be little room to dissipate energy after touchdown. The canopy remained fully open. Cold air rushed past Kim's face, burning his lungs with each breath. Carbon monoxide exposure had dulled his perception, and depth judgment became unreliable. He relied on familiar runway geometry rather than instinct, aligning the aircraft by reference to markings he had seen countless times before. Kim crossed the runway threshold high and fast, approximately 20 meters above the concrete. He recognized the error immediately, but had no means to correct it aggressively. A sharp pitch change would risk stall or loss of control. Instead, he held attitude and allowed the aircraft to settle under its own weight. Touchdown was violent. The left landing gear absorbed the initial impact, compressing fully but holding. The right gear failed almost instantly, folding beneath the aircraft. The Mustang yawed hard to the right. The right wing struck the surface, throwing sparks and fragments of metal outward. Momentum carried the aircraft through a partial rotation, nearly 180 degrees, before friction and damage brought it to a halt. Silence followed abruptly. The roar of wind and engine noise vanished, replaced by the ticking of cooling metal and the distant shouts of ground crews running toward the wreck. Smoke drifted upward in uneven plumes, but no fire followed. The risk that had followed Kim for the last several minutes did not materialize. He remained seated for several seconds, performing a deliberate internal check. Hands responded. Legs responded. Vision was blurred but intact. Only after confirming basic function did he release the harness and climb carefully onto the wing. The aircraft was destroyed. The mission was complete. The flight was over. Ground crews reached the aircraft within moments of its stop. Fire extinguishers were brought forward first, trained on the engine compartment and wing roots, where smoke still drifted upward. Medics followed close behind, moving with practiced urgency. Orders were shouted to cut magnetos, secure fuel lines, and clear the area. Kim was helped down from the wing rather than climbing under his own power. His legs responded poorly, shaking beneath him. An oxygen mask was placed over his face almost immediately. Only after he was seated on the concrete did the physical effects of the flight fully surface. His awareness narrowed, then wavered. The symptoms were consistent and unmistakable to the medical staff: severe carbon monoxide poisoning. His speech was slow and fragmented. Short-term memory gaps appeared within minutes. According to later evaluation, an additional 5 to 7 minutes of exposure inside the smoke-filled cockpit would have led to loss of consciousness in the air, followed by uncontrolled impact. Once the immediate medical risk was stabilized, attention shifted to the aircraft itself. The Mustang stood at an awkward angle on the damaged runway, its right wing scraped and twisted, its nose blackened by fire residue. The inspection that followed was methodical. Over 20 bullet impacts were documented across the wings and fuselage. The radiator assembly was completely destroyed. Oil lines were severed in multiple places. Several control cables showed signs of partial shredding and heat deformation. The Merlin engine was examined last. It told the clearest story. Cylinders had seized under extreme heat. The crankshaft showed visible warping. Connecting rods were fused by friction where lubrication had failed entirely. This was not a case of recoverable damage. The engine had exceeded its tolerances far beyond design limits. The aircraft was formally written off within hours. It would never fly again. The sortie, however, was recorded differently. Intelligence reports compiled later that day confirmed that the incoming strike against Seoul had failed completely. Bombs were released prematurely and fell well short of planned targets. 2 IL-10 ground attack aircraft were confirmed lost, with several more damaged. Crucially, no fuel depots, temporary bridges, or frontline medical facilities around the capital were destroyed that morning. The enemy's intended disruption did not occur. Those hours mattered. In mid-January 1951, time itself was a resource measured as carefully as ammunition or fuel. The Third Battle of Seoul was entering its decisive phase. The city would be abandoned again under pressure from advancing forces, but it would not be rendered inoperable by air attack. Roads remained usable. Evacuations continued. Command posts stayed intact long enough to coordinate withdrawal and reorganization. From a strategic perspective, the outcome was modest but meaningful. A single disrupted strike did not alter the course of the war, but it preserved local coherence at a critical moment. Defensive units gained time to reposition. Supplies already in motion reached their destinations. Casualty evacuation continued without interruption. In a campaign shaped by momentum, preventing collapse for even a single day could influence what followed. In official records, the engagement appeared as a brief entry, an intercepted formation, a disrupted attack. No dramatic language was used. There were no references to inverted flight or last-minute survival. Reports focused on results rather than process, as was customary. In wartime documentation, individual effort was secondary to operational effect. Yet air warfare is often decided in precisely these moments, not by large formations or sweeping offensives, but by isolated decisions made under constraint. In Korea, especially during the winter of 1950-1951, air superiority was uneven and frequently contested. Weather, terrain, and logistics narrowed margins until individual sorties carried disproportionate weight. By 1951, the F-51 Mustang was already considered outdated. Jet aircraft were redefining air combat doctrine, emphasizing speed, altitude, and interception. But over Korea, piston-engine fighters still carried much of the burden of close air defense. They flew low, slow, and exposed, operating where jets were less effective and where ground targets dictated risk. In those conditions, outcomes depended less on specifications than on endurance. Mechanical endurance, physical endurance, the ability to remain functional as systems failed and options disappeared. Kim Yong-soo returned to flying duty several months later. He flew again, with the same understanding of limits and consequence. His aircraft would never again be forced upside down to stay airborne. That January sortie left no monuments. There were no markings added to the runway, no ceremony attached to the wreckage. What remained was a destroyed aircraft, a scorched strip of concrete, and the city that endured one more day without being shattered from the air. Sometimes history does not change loudly. Sometimes it simply does not collapse, because one man refused to leave the sky. This concludes our look at one winter sortie over Korea, an episode where timing, endurance, and a single decision shape the outcome of a day. These moments rarely appear in headlines, but they define how wars are actually fought and survived. Thank you for watching and for spending this time with us. If you value careful historical storytelling, please subscribe to the channel. We'll see you in the next episode.